is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jacques Vallee. And we did all our introductions. We are a little over time. but you get it. You just, you're strong. You can stay a little longer to do it. And yes, because I thought it was very important to know who is here. It's a luxury that you don't have normally when you speak to TV or large lectures. And subliminally, you will be adapting your delivery to address the or maybe consciously. I will make very short the introduction. I want you to know that Dr. Vallee is an astronomer and also an astronomer in France, and also very knowledgeable in physics, but he studied also in America, in Illinois, computer science. So it's a very rounded education, and that's where he met Dr. Anna Hynek, or you knew him from before, but because you were in the same university. I myself, I was interested in UFOs in Argentina, where I'm from, and coming, exploring South America, I found a school of knowledge from outer space. It blew my mind. They were actually teaching people. It was a school, and so it was in Caracas. So what I did, I came back home. At that time, I was living already in the Bay Area, and I drove to Evanston, Illinois, to meet with Dr. Hynek. I had to tell someone, and he was the most respected fellow I had. The reason for my respect is being in Argentina, if you do what he did to the military here, to turn around and say, sorry.
Bye-bye.
Right. In Argentina, he will be killed before he leaves the room. Here, he survived that. I said, someone with such incredible courage, he's the one to tell. So I came and spent 3 days talking to him. And the next thing he did, he went to Venezuela. But that's another story. Before we left, he scribbled a phone number in a piece of paper and looked into my eyes and said, promise that you're going to call. And it was you.
Ah.
And we both lived in Belmont. How many people you know live in Belmont? But that wasn't a good time to meet. The circumstances were not right. So, look, this was 1979. I have been looking forward for this evening since then.
Really?
Yes. The proof is, here is Hynek, unfortunately, is long gone, but this book was signed by him in '79, and you didn't put a date. You have to put a date, that's what makes sense. And then I cornered him at the beginning when he had a minute to sign the book. So 33 years later, the two authors are in the book.
Ah.
Another thing you should know is Jacques is a businessman. He looks at the future and what technology will be necessary then, and invests and such. So has an angel investor and had put 20 companies, made 20 companies public. So, so not only he's a scientist, but he also understands how our economy works. I don't know of any other scientists who have launched 20 public companies.
There are a few.
There are a few. So we are up for a treat. I'm so glad that you're here. Sorry for the generic title. We did it on purpose so we are not overwhelmed. As you see, we don't have that much space. So would you help me welcome Dr. Jacques Vallee?
I may be here under some false pretenses because I'm not going to talk about UFOs, but as you will see, when you talk about the physics of the future, there may be many things in the future in physics, including UFOs, including new concepts in parapsychology and so on. So everything converges into that future. It's always a pleasure to be here at IONS. It's also a little bit overwhelming because you represent such a stellar set of talents and interests and passions and so on. So I hope I'm equal to that. This presentation, and I will reassure you immediately because that presentation I can do in 17 minutes. I prepared it initially for TED in Brussels. I was the privilege of being invited to TED, and I took as a subject the future of physics. The overall set of presentations at TED in Brussels just a month ago was the world of 50 years from now, 2061. And so I thought I would talk about the physics of 2061. They gave me 15 minutes. So I started working on the presentation and getting rid of slides until I had just a very small set. And then they said, well, we've redone the schedule, you have 8 minutes. So I told them, well, if I had known I only had 8 minutes, I would have picked a simpler subject, like the future of God or something like that. That's simple. And they said, no, well, you can have 18 minutes. So I did it in 17 minutes, which means we can go quickly through that and get to your questions and turn this into more of a conversation. At TED, you have 18 minutes and no questions. So the audience doesn't have you don't have a chance to interact with the audience. And to me, as wonderful as TED was, I come here to learn, and I'm going to learn from you. So I hope, and that's very much in the spirit of this place. This is a place for exchange and for learning from each other. So there are today in physics there are several theories of everything, which already tells you a lot about the state of physics. There are two major successful theories in physics. There is quantum mechanics, that several of you have mentioned, and it's often mentioned in connection with consciousness and non-local interaction and so on. But there is also general relativity, which is very successful. The only problem with those two theories is that they are in violent conflict with each other. Not in the things of everyday life, but certainly in terms of explaining gravity and a few other things. But in terms of the theory of gravitation, quantum mechanics and general relativity are in opposite, in conflict. People have been trying and are trying to resolve that conflict by coming up with new theories of everything that include string theory and other ways of looking at the world that are extremely interesting, and they will continue to do that. So that's why I call my presentation a theory of everything else. Because even if we reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity, there are a lot of things that are not going to be accounted for. And in that whole thing, we are missing a child. And the child we're missing is the little sister of physics, is the physics of information. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. And as you will see, when you start thinking about that concept of the physics of information, it starts hitting a number of the big questions that are going to be in our future. The physics they teach us in high school and college and university is the physics of energy. There's the physics of matter, the physics of particles, the physics of mass, the physics of fields, whatever the field is. And they also teach us that information and energy are two sides of the same coin, and that comes from thermodynamics. In the 19th century, James Maxwell reflected that if you, and it's difficult to talk about thermodynamics in a few words, but essentially if you pour a hot liquid into a cold liquid, they will mix and you'll have a liquid at an average temperature between the hot and the cold. You could stop that from happening if there was a demon, a little demon, Maxwell's demon, who carefully selected the hot molecules and put them in one corner and the cold molecules in another corner. Then that demon could, in fact, prevent the two liquids from mixing. Later, Leo Szilard, in the 20s, in the late 20s, Leo Szilard was a colleague of Einstein. Leo Szilard was a co-author with Einstein of the letter to the President of the United States, stating that they could make an atom bomb. So Leo Szilard was a well-known physicist in the 20s and 30s. He reflected further about the concept of Maxwell's demon, that for the demon to do what Maxwell was projecting, in other words, separating the hot liquid from the cold liquid and keeping them apart, that demon had to have information about every molecule. So if he knows that this particular molecule is hot, that particular molecule is cold, the demon can separate them. That means that there is as much information in the system as there is energy. And that in fact, energy and information are two sides of the same coin. So why is it that they teach us the physics of energy and they don't teach us the physics of information? I mean, there is the missing little sister of physics is out there somewhere lost. So my argument is, let's go look for it and save this child. So the physics of energy has to do with these things: particles, atoms, fundamental forces, mass, entropy, fields, space dimensions, x, y, and z, and time, and momentum and inertia and speed and quanta and quantum physics. We don't have anything similar on the side of the physics of information. We don't have similar concept. Hasn't been done. I dropped out of physics. I have, as was kindly mentioned before, I have an advanced degree in physics, but the only reason is that I was good in math. So I could find out the equations, and then I could work out the equations and get the result. So I was a good student. But there were a couple of things that I just didn't get along with in the physics that they were teaching me. The first one has to do with time. They say in the equations, so you have x, y, and z. So x, I understand, x is this direction, and then y is this direction, and z is going up. Okay. So I get that from common experience. In the equation, you also have time, because we are in a four-dimensional universe, so says Einstein. So you have t for time, along with x, y, and z. And it doesn't quite work, so you put an I in front of t, and I is square root of minus 1. So in mathematics, that's fine. You do that, the equations work, you solve the problem, everything is fine. Except that in time, I can't do this, and turn around and do that. Now, what kind of a dimension is that? When you can only go one way, and you cannot go the other way. And you can't, there are a lot of things that you can do with dimensions that you cannot do with time. So that was one thing that I had a lot of trouble with. And nobody would talk about that. The other thing is gravity. So we know how time passes, we don't know why time passes. we know why things fall down, you know, and we don't know why they fall down. Okay? So if I was teaching physics in high school, I would do 2 experiments. I would have the students watch, you know, 1 minute going by, and I would tell them this is something that we cannot explain in physics. And then I would drop my pen, and I would tell them this is experiment number 2. We don't explain that either. Now we go on. We go on with physics. And now there are circular ways of saying. I mean, there is a field here which is a gravity field. So you say, what's a gravity field? Well, it's a field such that if you put something in it, that's the definition. I'm not kidding. So there are ways around that, saying space is curved and so on. But we still, and again, this is where the conflict comes between general relativity and quantum physics. The other thing that really disgusted me was particles. Because we have electrons and protons and neutrons, but there are things inside that are subparticles. And then the subparticles, it still doesn't quite work right when you look at what particles do in a bubble chamber. So you still lose energy somewhere or add energy somewhere, so you invent another subparticle of the subparticle of the particle. And that reminds me of something that happened in astronomy in the Middle Ages, where, of course, God had created the universe, and God apparently only understood circles, so everything had to be a perfect circle, except that planets kind of work in perfect circles, except that sometimes they are not quite on the right circle. So they invented epicycles that were circles around the circle. And then that still didn't quite work as they got better and better telescopes and better observations. There was still a little delta, you know, a little difference. So they invented another epicycle. Now, if you can do that far enough, you can explain everything. When I was at Northwestern in the astronomy department with Dr. Heine, one of my buddies was a graduate student at the, actually programmed the Northwestern computer to compute the future positions of planets for 1,000 years using cycles and epicycles. So essentially, it's a Fourier series. If you know. So you can always do that, except that that's not the way reality is. And I suspect that there is something like that in the physics of particles. I mean, you fall into these traps. Yeah. So where is the missing sister of physics, and what kinds of questions would she be asking? The people who do physics of energy are going to go on doing that, and eventually it's going to get better and better. I mean, we are going to understand a lot more about particles, about interaction, and eventually we may even reconcile general relativity with quantum mechanics. In the meantime, there are a number of things that we are not really tackling that are showing up increasingly as the world accelerates and as computers become more powerful and so on. And that includes coincidences. Coincidences are very interesting. Just to give you one example, in the 90s, we used to have a house up north from here in the Redwoods, somewhere between Ukiah and Willits. Actually, it was a ranch with a beautiful house where it was sort of our retreat away from the world. And one evening we had some friends over for dinner, and one of them was a woman who was going to be in a play in Ukiah. And in the play she was going to be reading something in French, and she hadn't practiced French for a while, so she asked if we had a book in French which she could use to practice. And we had a bookshelf with books in novels and books in French and English, and my wife pulled a novel at random from the bookshelf. It was this novel, La peau de César by Jacques Vallee. And she gave it to me, and I opened it at a page at random, and I read the passage. And the passage was, I was in the Boeing that blew up after takeoff at Kennedy Airport, a bomb in a hold, 132 dead. Remember. This was 3 days after sorry, this is not recognition, but this was 3 days after TWA 800 blew up, taking off from Kennedy and blew up over the Atlantic. And, well, we've all had, when you start talking to people about that, you find out that most people have had coincidences like that. And you go through a very strange few seconds or minutes after something like that, because it hits you. But then you have to go on living, and there is no explanation, and there is no obvious link with what you're doing. So it's just one of those things. And I went, even though I was involved in studies of consciousness and so on at the time, there was a stunned silence when I read that, and of course everybody was, the accident was under study, and over 200 people had died in the explosion of TWA 800. I had taken TWA 800 many times, several times, going to Paris. So this was, I could have been on that thing with my kids. I mean, this was something that was emotionally profound. And why this book? Why this particular page? Why this particular passage? But then you sort of forget it and you go on. And, until you really put your attention on it and you start looking at that kind of coincidence. A lot of people have been thinking about the physics of information, even though there is no real discipline around that. And that includes Fascius Cardan, who was a scientist, one of those universal scientists in the 15th century, and he writes in his diary, it's a very interesting passage in his Apology for My Life, Apologia for Vita Sua, per Vita Sua. He says that having performed the customary rites to invoke the creatures of the air, the elementals of the air, 7 sylphs appeared before him in his laboratory. And there was a belief in the Middle Ages in creatures of the air, Paracelsus and so on, creatures of the air, creatures of the water, creatures of the earth, and so on, creatures of fire. So it was a magical ritual, but it was something that was accepted in terms of spiritual practice, to be in contact with these entities, whatever they were. But here these 7 sylphs appeared in his laboratory, and 2 of them were the chiefs, and they came forward. And he discussed with them the nature of the universe. He thought these elementals, whatever they were, must have higher knowledge of the nature of the universe, and a way to have a conversation with them. What was interesting was that the 2 sylphs disagreed. One of them said, well, God created the universe once and for all, and here we are. The other one said, no, God was creating the universe from moment to moment, and if he should stop, everything would vanish. Which actually relates to an Arabic philosophy of much earlier century, which is called occasionalism, with Averroes and other Arabic thinkers. In occasionalism, this pen is not the pen I had in my pocket earlier, it's another occasion of the same pen. So these pens are being created by a higher plane that is creating them from moment to moment, and that's what the other sylphs were. That's, in fact, that relates to quantum mechanics. I mean, the world is essentially created from moment to moment. Which is very interesting that these 2 sylphs disagree about the nature of the universe and how God made it work. In that sense, the paranormal is normal, because if this disappeared, and in magic you make things disappear, you could make this pen disappear, but that wouldn't be unusual because it's just that particular occasion of the pen isn't there. And in terms of software, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it just means that there is a software metasystem that is creating everything that shares the computers, us. And if there is a bug in the software, it will disappear or will turn into something else. So as a software buff, and as a computer scientist, I like it. I mean, this is something I resonate with much more than the physics of energy. Well, a lot of other people have thought about this, and some very prestigious people have thought about this deeply. That includes Wolfgang Pauli, who was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, Carl Jung, and there is extensive correspondence between Pauli and Jung on this topic, and on the topic of coincidences. Paul Kammerer, Arthur Koestler, The Roots of Coincidence, David Bohm, Max Wermeltz, Philippe Guillemot in France, Landauer, Seth Lloyd, and so on. And I think I'm sure you would find these books in the library here. Jung was especially interested in coincidences, and he compiled a list of coincidences that had happened to them, some of which are absolutely stunning. One time he was working with a patient, with a woman patient, who had a pretty intense dream, and in that dream there was a golden scarab. And he was fascinated with this because the golden scarab, of course, in Egyptian history and culture is a very important symbolic object. And as he was talking to her about the scarab, a golden scarab flew in the window and hit the window of his study. Well, so he writes about that in his books. He also writes about a time when he was giving a lecture in another city, and he was in a hotel. He fell asleep and then woke up with the feeling that there was somebody in the room. He actually got up from his bed and checked, and there was nobody in the room and nobody around. He also had the feeling of something hitting his forehead and something in the back of his head. He realized there was nobody there, went back to bed and went to sleep. The next day he got a telegram that one of his patients had shot himself in the head, through the forehead, and the bullet had lodged itself in the back of the head. It's, again, the kind of thing that people have tried to collect and think about, that for which there is no real obvious observation. I mean, this is not, you're not going to explain that with quantum mechanics. Okay? I don't care what you do with quantum mechanics. One of the, at the risk of being slightly controversial, quantum mechanics is involved in a lot of consciousness studies because nobody understands consciousness and nobody understands quantum mechanics. So the two, there must be some link between the two if you don't understand either one of them. And there are potential mechanisms in quantum mechanics that are important for the study of consciousness, but you're not going to explain, either one of these coincidences with quantum mechanics. So we need something else. There was another thing that I went through that is worth mentioning. I was, when I was working on one of my books, at the same time actually on a book called Invisible College, I was very concerned about what I was seeing happening in California and elsewhere with people believing in UFOs and ETs and aliens and so on, but driven into cults. And to some extent, it's a fault of science, of not addressing the questions that people have. That is driving people who have had an experience, know that they've seen something unusual, know that they've seen some sort of craft that they couldn't explain. And since astronomers or scientists won't talk to them, they tend to be captured by cults that pretend to have all the answers. And some of these cults were pretty extreme. In one of my books, I warned against joining these cults and was heavily criticized for that. And one of the cults that I warned against was a cult called Bo and Pete, the two, because I had attended one of their lectures at Stanford. One of the students at Stanford had asked, what does it cost to join you guys? They were going to go away and be picked up by the UFO someday. And the answer was, it only costs your life. And I warned against that in my book. That group eventually committed suicide in San Diego. 54 members committed suicide because they thought that there was a spaceship coming alongside a comet in the sky. And that was the time to join the spaceship behind the comet, and they drank the Kool-Aid. So at the time, there were a number of these cults calling themselves the Order of Melchizedek, or using the figure of Melchizedek as the inspiration for the sect of the cult. And that really intrigued me. Melchizedek is a very interesting figure in the Bible. He's a very mysterious figure. He's one of the most powerful figures in the Bible, even though he's only mentioned in a couple of lines, because he initiated Abraham. And by initiating Abraham, he started actually the three religions of the book: the Islamic religion, the Jewish religion, and the Christian religion. So he's represented in a few places. This is a representation of Melchizedek at Chartres Cathedral, which is an extraordinary set of sculptures. So I was working on that, tracking down these orders of Melchizedek in France and in California, trying to get documentation on Melchizedek. But I was also giving an interview that day at KABC in Los Angeles. So I stepped out of my hotel, stopped a taxi from the flow of traffic, got in the cab, got to KABC, did the interview, flew home, and then I did my expense report for the publisher, and the taxi receipt was signed Melchizedek. So that put me in a strange state also, because at the time there were experiments going on at SRI. Uri Geller was at SRI. Uri thought that he was in contact with an extraterrestrial civilization through a space platform called Huva that was giving him instructions and responding. So I thought, well, there is a system out there that seems to be aware of what I'm doing. They're sending me cab drivers for lack of anything else. Call Melchizedek. So I thought, this is, look, I'm a computer scientist. We were working on the ARPANET, which was the prototype for the internet. And by the way, there were social networks in 1971. And we're working with communication systems with the first computer networks, right? So there should be a way of triggering that system if it's a system that responds. So I tried a number of things, sending messages into the ether through the ARPANET, and trying a number of things. Nothing worked. So there were other coincidences. For example, the lady who was typing my book in Palo Alto got to the place where I was talking about Melchizedek, and she said that she was really interested in what I'm typing now is really interesting because I'm a Mormon. The Mormons have a special relationship to Melchizedek, a special place for Melchizedek in their structure. And she said, my best friend is doing a master's degree at Brigham Young University on Melchizedek. Would you like it? It's not published yet, but if you like the manuscript. So I thought, all these things having to do with Melchizedek was sort of accumulating, at the same time. I finally convinced myself that there is no system. In other words, it has nothing to do with me. It's just the way the universe is open. And you just like when you put a request in Google, you're going to get a lot of things. You're going to get hundreds of thousands of things that have to do with your request. Many of them are really irrelevant. I mean, they just happen to intersect your request in some space somewhere that, you know, in the innards of Google, that Google thought they should give you. But only a few of those are going to be significant for you. Well, maybe the universe of information is like that. Maybe it is this very vast structure that can be triggered in some way, yet to be discovered, to give us some answers. Now, that could apply to remote viewing, that could apply to telepathy, that could apply to a number of things. But there seems to be a medium of information that has structures that are undiscovered. So I went back and thought, given that I'm not privileged to be in contact with some cosmic system that's responding to what I'm doing, that it's just the way things are set up. In other words, again, the paranormal is normal. What does that really mean? And what does that really mean about dimensions? If you have so let's go back to computer science for a while. If you have a small library, this is the Library of Congress, 43 million books. 43 million books is what Facebook does in one afternoon. Today, Google, YouTube is 35 hours of YouTube uploaded to Google per minute. Per minute. Okay? Most of that is a cat playing with a piece of wire. But there are all kinds of other things in it, and it gets uploaded into the computers of Google. 35 hours of video per minute. Well, this is an enormous amount of information. If you have a small library and somebody sends you 10,000 books and you have enough staff people, that afternoon you can get your staff people to. So that library, as you can see, is X, Y, and Z. I mean, this is the physics of energy again. Okay, you have vertical structures and you have horizontal, platforms, and you put the books on. Okay? So if the staff people can push the books aside and insert the new books. So somebody sends you 10,000 new books a day. That's not a problem because you can always reorder the books by hand. Okay. If you have a modern library which looks like this, this is Google, this is Facebook, this is Twitter, terabytes a day, many terabytes a day, there is no way you can use X, Y, and Z. There is no way you can use the coordinates of the physics of energy, the good old physics we learned in school. What you do is you sprinkle the information into a mass storage medium, into an infinite virtual memory, and then if somebody asks a question about it, you have a hashing code, you have a statistical way of getting back to the information they need. And it's essentially you spread the information around within an infinite space. And that may be a better analogy. And again, I'm not making a crude comparison between the universe and any technology we have today. It's like people who say, the brain is a calculating machine, and then the brain is a computer, and then the brain is a quantum computer, and then the brain is, the universe is not a library, although that itself would be interesting. But it's just a crude analogy, but you see what I'm getting at. It's not organized with X, Y, and Z, and T, and so it's something else. And that's what I think we're tapping into with synchronicity, with coincidences, with that. A number of people are beginning to do serious research about that, including some classic physicists. Dr. Guillemot in France, whom we met recently, has published a book called The Road of Time, La Route du Temps, in which he says the future is already realized and in transformation under the influence of our observations and intentions. And synchronicities are caused by a double causality. Our intentions cause effects in the future that become the future causes of present effects. And I know, you've thought about along the same lines, and a number of people are now converging on that kind of concept. So to conclude, and then we can have more dialogue and more conversation. But to conclude, I see 4 requirements for the physics in the next 50 years, among other things. First, recognize that the universe we perceive as a subsystem of a meta-reality of information associations. In other words, there is information and there are associations of information, and what we perceive is what comes out of that meta-reality. Like the self was saying, this is something that's happening from moment to moment. Dimensions is an artifact of our culture. I mean, we needed dimensions to understand the steam engine, to understand locomotives. We've all done the problem. A train leaves Baltimore at 6:05 and it's going to Kansas City at 60 miles an hour. At how much time will elapse before it passes Chicago? And so if you do that, you need graph paper. And if you need graph paper, you need dimensions, and everything works well, and that's fine. We can do physics, but we're getting to the point where that idea is breaking down in many places. We should do away with dimensions. We don't really need them. In the physics of information, we don't really need dimensions at all. So it's not a question of coming up with a universe with 11 dimensions or multiple universes with different numbers of dimensions, which is now mainstream in cosmology. People are thinking along those lines. But in what we're discussing here, we really don't need dimensions. You can create what you need as you go on, the way a programmer would do. The present is overdetermined. I mean, I think that's what Guillemot is saying. The present is overdetermined from the past and from the future. We're here because we had planned, because of Sergio, and we had planned to come here, but during that time when we were planning it, that was in the future. And now we are here, and we're here because we're overdetermined from an intention we had in the past, projecting into the future, and actually driving here. And that's this moment is overdetermined.
Great.
And finally, can
But
I don't know how to back up.
Down arrow. I mean, up arrow. Sorry. Here.
Thank you. Consciousness is what we need, what we use to traverse associations. So there is essentially a universe of events, a universe of occasions in the Arabic philosophy that is simultaneous, there's no time. And our consciousness is selecting associations of events as it goes along, and that's what we perceive as reality. So consciousness is what we use to traverse associations, generating the impression of space and time. So with those constraints, I think we should go out and rescue her. And that's essentially what I have to say.
thank you.
Question. questions?
Of course, that's the important thing. The important thing.
It's a pleasure to be able to do this in more than 17 Be a little bit more relaxed. Yes, Steve.
Sounds good. First of all, two things quickly. I noted the self-scoped academus, or one of the selves, indicated that God was creating reality from moment to moment, and if God stopped, then everything would be total. If I'm not mistaken, that's happening later this year, is it not? That's my understanding. The other thing was, with respect to Jung, if we were to accept that the two events, the suicide of his patient and his experience in the bedroom, regardless of how comprehensible the modality of the connection is, without question, no one would argue that a transference of information took place between those two things. Whatever the method. That he had, the information would be the connection, experience, whatever. Is that very representative of the concept that you're trying to get across of the physics of information?
So I've started to, a number of people have published lists of coincidences, and a number of my friends have started to do their own catalog of coincidences. I've started to do that, and I'm only at the beginning of doing that, because I've had more, and I think all of us have had that kind of experience. I've had more than the two that I mentioned here. When I look at that, some of them you would call precognition. Some of them, so I mean ordinary precognition. I mean in this environment, politics, you can say things like common everyday precognition.
All the time. That's all we do here is precognition.
Some of it is you could call remote viewing. I mean, you could say Jung had an instance of spontaneous remote viewing. The remote viewers, that SRI and other places describe things like that. Experience all of a sudden, they know something is happening or has happened. There are other things that, well, for example, the thing with the book about TW800, that wasn't even precognition. I mean, this was 3 days later. So it's as if there were events that radiated something that reorganized the information space in some way. Now, why did my wife pick up this particular novel, which is not a very good novel, I mean, it was just sitting on the shelf, okay, and why did I open it at that page, 3 days after the crash of TW800. So you have the feeling that some events sort of bleed over a number of days or a number of hours, and that somehow they reorganize reality around certain people. Now, why those particular people and not others, we don't know. Jeff Kripal, in his latest book called Mutants and Mystics, tells a number of these stories. One of his friends that we met, Dean and I met at SLM, is a writer of comic books. He is in his study writing about an intruder in a house who hijacks, comes into the house and takes control of the woman who is there, and then at the same time he hears his wife going in, somewhat urgently, goes into the next room. There is an intruder, who has captured his wife and probably wants money or something else. Well, why was he writing that particular thing in the comic book as this was happening in the next room? My friend named Michel was working on something, and all of a sudden there is a tune, classical music piece that haunts him, and to get rid of it, he goes downstairs and plays it on the piano. turns on the radio, and the same thing is played on the radio. Now, why? That makes no sense, except that you have something that's radiating somehow and reorganizing and can be picked up by somebody. It doesn't serve any purpose. It's not remote viewing really. It's not recognition really.
But the implication of your TED Talk would be that if we understood the physics of information as well as we understand the physics of space, time, and energy, these connections would be readily apparent.
I think we're a long way from that, but we have 50 years.
If we did, if we were there, I suspect that then we would, oh, of course, that's how.
It would be, and you have that kind of coincidence with UFOs. You have certainly that kind of coincidence in parapsychology.
Could you speak up just a little, please? Could you speak up just a little?
Yes, well, I was saying you have that kind of coincidence in parapsychology. You have it with UFOs, you have it with the paranormal in general. I mean, there is a classic story that happened to Hal Puthoff that's, I think, recounted in Remote Viewers, a book by Jim Schnabel, about a case where, again, Geller was at Livermore, and there was something about one of the physicists, after Geller was tested at Livermore, there were a number of things that happened to people, to physicists and engineers around Livermore, some of which happened in their own homes afterwards, like apparitions in the middle of the night. One of the apparitions to one of the scientists, who I think resigned from Livermore after that, was an arm, just an arm in the air over his bed, that just terrified him. Al Puthoff was in Washington, had to meet somebody, was in a hotel. I don't remember exactly what the circumstances were, but somebody knocks on the door. They were talking about a part of the program that was classified and so on, so they were a little bit paranoid about somebody coming in because he was talking to someone who was not part of the program at that point, if I remember correctly, but was from one of the three-letter agencies. And so they wondered who that was, and they opened the door, and it's a guy with no arm. I mean, with only one arm, he's missing one arm. Right in the middle of a series of things where there was an apparition of an arm attached to another. What do you do with things? 10 years later, I could have still talking about that as if there was a meta system. And I think, being a computer scientist, I've written metacompilers. Metacompiler is a system that generates compilers that enable you to compile your program so you can run your program. And metacompilers are very interesting because they generate reality. They generate languages that people can use to manipulate reality in the computer. Well, this looks like a meta system to me. In other words, it's no use, and you find the same thing in some areas of the paranormal, and certainly in some areas of ufology, that you shouldn't look at what you see as an object, but as something that is the expression of a higher level system for the purpose of that particular observer, or that particular site, or that particular time, and it may never happen again the same way. But it may happen several times to the same person.
Do you have a theory of what that metasystem is? Do you think it is information that some people can tap into and others can't? Is it something other people can manipulate and others can't? What do you think the metasystem is?
I don't really have a theory. I'm calling for, I'm sort of trying to state a framework under which we can think about a theory. People like Guillemot in France, have a particular theory they are pursuing. If the place where I come from is that this is the universe. I mean, that's the way the universe is. And we all are part of it because the reality we experience is drawn from that information space.
But some of us have experiences like that, and most people don't.
I think if you talk to your neighbors,
Most people do.
around
To
a beer
laugh.
or a cup of coffee, they just don't talk about it.
Mhm.
Yeah. After the presentation at TED, I've gotten a number of letters and so people relating to me coincidences that they've experienced that either they didn't remember or they didn't tell anybody.
Years ago, I used to tell people about things before they happened, including an earthquake. One of them, actually two earthquakes, one 3 days before it hit, and one about 30 seconds before it hit. I don't understand, but it's creepy, and I don't run into other people talking about that kind of thing. But I've also never heard anybody talk about what you're talking about.
One of the things that you want to do if we start studying this and seeing if we can create environments where coincidences happen more often. I tried for a number of years. I mean, the reason I had a place in the Redwoods was that we had essentially no neighbors closer than half a mile, and I assembled a fairly large library, fairly large esoteric library that covered parapsychology and esoteric traditions and so on, thinking this is going to be a singularity, and if we create an information singularity, maybe things will happen. And of course, I was hoping it would be UFOs. I would be able to. There were a few events that we couldn't explain, but there was really over 20 years, I mean, there was no special thing happening.
That you remember.
Well, there were several of us there, and listen.
Yeah, getting back to that Bowen coincidence example, you say that book was a Harlequin romance novel?
No, it was a French novel
Oh, it's a French novel.
that had been published in 1981.
Okay, so it was published much earlier. What do you think? Do you think there's a possibility of a collective consciousness creating events?
Well, that's what Jung was speculating about. I mean, it was one of Jung's theories that there is this thing called the collective consciousness, from which symbols may emerge or events may emerge and so on. I'm certainly not an expert on Jungian psychology, but he, as you may know, he wrote a book about UFOs, about flying saucers, a modern myth. And by myth, he didn't mean that they really exist. He meant, the concept of an object that was related to tradition, was related again to the collective unconscious. And he was struck with the fact that most UFOs are round and like the mandala, and the mandala is related obviously to symbols, a number of symbols in the collective unconscious. And so he was thinking along those lines, but it still doesn't explain these coincidences.
I can't help but share this with you. In 1982, a friend of mine and I were on a trip to India with 30 people. And about 2 years ago, my friend was thinking, I wish I had a documentation. I know somebody was taking a movie of following the trip. I wish I could get my hands on it. I don't have any idea how to do that. This was 2 years ago. And the same afternoon, he was walking along the marina, and there's a Safeway there, and he was passing through the Safeway parking lot. There was a plastic bag floating around the parking lot. He thought, I better pick this up and put it in the trash. He picked up the plastic bag, went to the dumpster, picked up the dumpster, and there was a video sitting on top of all of the trash in the dumpster. He put in the plastic bag and looked at the video, and it was the video of our trip through India.
See,
It's all explained by quantum reality.
What was that?
Quality.
What did you say? Doc?
He has more
So it's explained
experiences
by
on a
quantum
daily
mechanics.
basis with synchronicities.
This happens to him all the time.
And it happens to me a lot too, but I don't manifest things, I just speak something and I hear, it can be an esoteric word and it's spoken simultaneously on the radio. Or I'm writing something out and it's spoken on the radio while I'm writing it. And like that happens all the time. The other, I said to my husband, we were getting married and I said, we should get out our Jacques Vallee coffee maker, we haven't used it for a year or two. And within 3 minutes, there was a phone call that came through. And I didn't answer it, I just let the machine take it, and I went to see what the machine, who had called me? Jacques Vallee called me. It's on my answering machine right there, Jacques Vallee. It's like, what? You know, they've never called me, why would they, you know? Craziness, craziness. Happens all the time.
It's fun.
That's
It's fun.
Do you think there's a way that we can tap into these coincidences any more than we already do, than just these aha moments, but consciously direct?
Well, of course, the esoteric tradition claim that you can make things appear by following certain rituals and so on. I mean, that's what Cardan was doing. He doesn't explain what the ritual was, but he was following obviously some sort of invocation to make these creatures appear. I have no evidence that it works. Of course, that's what prayer is. And you can argue, whether or not it works. Again, what I tried to do was create an information singularity to see whether that could trigger something. I mean, that's more going back into the physics of energy, of entropy. If you could create a large decrease or increase in entropy in a particular place, would that punch a hole in that information universe and make a coincidence happen? I don't know. I mean, all I can say is that what I tried didn't work. So,
In the question of focused attention or intention, I was teaching at San Jose State, and we were talking about the friendly universe, or whatever we want to call this, and a large wasp came into the classroom. It was bouncing around on the ceiling, real high ceiling. Then there was about a 4-foot drop, and into the place where the windows were, and the windows opened like that. So for the wasp to leave the room, it had to go over and go down that 4-foot thing and under that window. So I asked the class, I said, what we have here is a test of our consciousness. We know how the wasp can get out of the room. The wasp doesn't know. Can we tell the wasp how to get out of the room? And so I said, let's each make a picture of how we think the wasp could get out of the room. It was out of the room in less than 2 minutes. It went right over and under the window. I was just as surprised as everybody else.
and the
But
last.
the level of imagining the possibility, which the wasp didn't have, but human beings do. From my point of view, concentrated that energy and told the wasp how to get out of the room. And I think that there's a lot of that potential right now, where people are imagining things. And the question is, are they imagining them together, and is there intention in it? Or have we got a lot of confusion, a lot of misdirected intention?
Well, it's a well-known fact in Silicon Valley, certainly among my colleagues in the investment community. Somebody comes into my office with an invention or an idea, my first reaction has to be, are there 10 other people who have come up with the same idea at the same time? And that's, of course, the lawyers who specialize in intellectual property have to, fight with that all the time, because ideas tend to emerge, including very, very unusual concepts in technology, tend to emerge at the same time.
Well, Newton and Leibniz was a very early one.
All the experiences that people have shared and you have shared about the coincidences are very inspirational and give us a lot of inspiration for what's the bigger picture. Your talk today was how do we understand this bigger picture and what's the framework for us to understand. You're presenting an information-based framework, and calling physics of information provokes interesting thoughts of taking information and bringing it into the physical world and what the interplay is. But my question is, so before I get to my question, maybe in 2051, the unification of mathematics and computer science and physics and all of that will come together to a point, and consciousness, to a point where we understand how to understand these things. But coming from the other way, we're here in 2012 now. A lot of research going on in big data. And if we say it's not the physical world, but it's the cyber world, there's a lot of good research going on in understanding how information and behavior of people that are acting in that cyber world correlate. Do you feel, the question is, do you feel that a small stepping stone to get to 2051 is for the next 5 years, 10 years, to understand those coincidences in the cyber world, or those anomalies, we might think they're anomalies, but to understand why these associations or aggregations happen? Is the cyber world a good playground for us, with a lot of smart people thinking about these problems, to understand this, and not only understanding the anomalies or the coincidences, but also understanding the boring stuff? I mean, if we truly think we all have these capabilities, then just us sitting here listening to a lecture is also very special, just as all the other experiences are very special also. But we're just assigning a value to it because of our understanding of the universe. So I'm trying to understand whether you think that today's investigations in big data, analytics, insights derived from data, turning data into information, into knowledge, into awareness, that is important.
I think it's important in two ways. First, it's a source of analogies, and you can't, again, we're still dealing with pretty crude technology, but it's crude, but it's really big, and it's getting bigger quickly. So it's a source of analogies like the one they've used between a small library, like the Library of Congress, and a big interactive library like Facebook, where you don't have time to put things in neat places. They have to find their place, and you have to find them somehow very quickly later on. But I think beyond that kind of analogy, it enables us to think about that kind of thing. We're creating something that's essentially out of control. I mean, when you have 35 hours of YouTube video per minute, that means the world is changing. It is changing in big ways, and the infrastructure is changing, and the way the new generation is thinking about information is changing. So we're creating something that is going to have its own phenomena that we can't really sit here and predict. I mean, one of the things we did when SRI started doing the studies of remote viewing, actually they started out with fairly general studies in parapsychology. We were working on the first computer conferencing system on the network using the ARPANET, funded by National Science Foundation and ARPA, now DARPA. And the idea was to link experts together. Now, the experts we were going to link together were going to be experts in energy and physics and other things. They were not going to be programmers. So we had to do something that was very easy to use, where the human engineering had to be perfect, and could work very, very fast. And these people were all going to be typing at the same time. Okay. So my team and I started pushing the system to its limit and studying what was happening. And I had a sociologist on my team also. And we started noticing that, for example, people would answer a question before the question was posed. And those would be unrelated to the subject that they were talking about. All of a sudden somebody would say, by the way, there is an interesting movie in San Jose, and then 2 seconds, 2 seconds later, somebody would say, I'm going to be in San Jose tomorrow, is there any interesting movie? So, except that we could, so that kind of anecdote is all over parapsychology, except we could document it because we had a timestamp on every message. And we knew these people couldn't communicate any other way.
It's a nice laboratory.
So we started looking at it with Arthur Hastings, who's well known to many here, I'm sure, who's at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology now. And I actually brought in Arthur as a consultant to my project. And we actually wrote a paper in the Futurist called, I think, in 73, something like that, 1973, called Computer Conferencing in Altered State of Communication. And what we were speculating about is that, when engineers want you to communicate, they want to give you the widest possible channel. They want to get close to face-to-face. Now, face-to-face is not the best way to communicate, because you're distracted by, the color of somebody's hair, or the way they gesticulate, or whatever. And there are different channels of communication that are much better. For example, if you're communicating numbers, telex is absolutely the best way, which is why the ticker, on Wall Street is a telex. I mean, it's essentially a telex on your TV. It's a telex. It doesn't have pictures, it doesn't have graphics, it doesn't have anything else, just a bunch of numbers. And that's the most accurate recollection. The phone is pretty good for some things, but on the phone, if I say 14, you might hear 40, because I have a French accent, and if I say 14, I will tell you 14, 1-4, because I know that you could be confused with, my accent. But it's certainly not good for communicating numbers. It's good because you can tell if I'm excited or not. You can tell if I'm tired. You can tell if I'm scared. You can tell if I like you or if I don't like you. I mean, you can tell a lot of things. Telex wouldn't tell you. But the video might not tell you that. The video is actually one of the worst ways of communicating analogy. So we thought, here we have these very bright people who are communicating for the first time across a computer network. So we've annihilated time and space for them. They are essentially, we didn't think of cyberspace, but that's essentially what we were saying. They are above time and space. And they are intensely communicating with each other. And we've given them a little keyboard, with 26 keys on it. So what they have to do has to be funneled into a very narrow channel that's very uncomfortable, because some of them knew how to type, most of them didn't. And perhaps by restricting the channel, we opened up something else, and that's why they answer questions before the question is asked. So that's the paper we wrote. And I'm still proud of the fact that we did that in a study, because now that kind of thing can happen now on Facebook and Twitter and so on in a much larger
I think the observable on a mass scale, and it's a nice laboratory to try out some of the modeling techniques and other things.
Yes,
just maybe show even mundane things that might help us build the knowledge to understand more the coincidences.
Yes, I think that in that environment there will be things that will start resonating in ways we haven't seen before. That should be interesting. Steve?
First, I want to let you know that the reason that no UFOs turned up at your place those 20 years in the Redwoods was because they were all over Stephen Greer's place. So much interest, so few saucers. There have been some very interesting group experiments that are somewhat well known, which sort of transcend the anecdotal coincidence phenomenon. One, of course, is the random number generator at Princeton, which had some extraordinary spikes around certain events, particularly 911 at the time. Another, Art Bell did some collective consciousness experiments on his show, and the results were so startling that he actually said, "I will not do this again because I'm playing with the primal forces." And then a notable, and I actually was in Washington at the time, a notable experiment, not experiment, but action by the Maharishi in Transcendental Meditation, when they actually brought a number, I think it was 800, 900 individuals into Washington, D.C. Took residence for a period of time, I think it was 30 days, meditated with the specific intention to drop the crime rate, which did profoundly. These things don't get a lot of awareness, but they clearly speak to something powerful. How does that work into your thinking?
I think those are the kinds of experiments that, if we could repeat them, and of course that has been done in other areas of parapsychology, especially with meditators and so on. If we could find the people who had that kind of talent, you would begin to learn more about that organization of the information. One of the areas is, you were mentioning the random number generators at Princeton, that network. That relates to the idea, again, with the TW800, does an event like that have an aura, for lack of a better term, that can be picked up? Does it resonate in some way, and then does it manifest in various ways? I think we're just at the beginning of that kind of experiment. It should be more.
I think it's already come into the mainstream that, aside from us here, people know when you say 100th monkey in Safeway. Most people would know what that means, and the meditation experiments, and just where you're standing, Rupert Sheldrake presented a talk not on on morphogenetic fields, but on the animal work that he was doing. So I think it's known, and I think using it is more interesting than just studying it, although they kind of go together. But I wanted to say that the internet has made the biggest quantum leap in our synergy to allow the 35 hours and the Googling and the communication for Arab Springs and American Falls and the rest. We know the programmers who created that, but we're kind of begging the question for the programmers who may have created the meta-programs. And just along those lines, I've been having a lot of communication myself with the author of a book who is in communication with a group called the Ra Group and the Elohim. And of course, in the Old Testament, the Elohim are credited with creating all of this.
Yes.
And it seems to turn out that they exist and they continue to turn energy into form and are ready to talk to people. And so for Googling purposes, the author's name is Win Free, and the name Elohim, if you Google that, it'll come up, and he makes the work very widely available for free. There are calls and books to download and stuff like that. So I think we are on that breakthrough place where it's got to get better because worse is not an option.
By the way, there is a simple bibliography of papers and books. As you can see, there are a number of people who are publishing on this topic. So what I'm doing here is just touching on something that's much bigger. A lot of people have gotten involved. So and maybe I can email this to you, and you can
Yes,
circulate
gladly.
it. Or,
Sure.
and again, there are many more, but you can Understanding Consciousness by Vermont, so this is fairly recent, but you can go back to, Landauer. This is in the communications of the IEEE, so these are, professional physicists and engineers looking at it. Ian?
What do you suppose is the relationship here between information and meaning? Because you can have huge amounts of information that don't mean anything. And what you're talking about is meaning, which is kind of a meta information.
Yes, and you have the three levels of the data and the information, and then the semantics of the meaning, and they very often get confused, around computers. You can have a lot of data without having information, and you can have information without having meaning. This idea of the time, I also work with people who look at the future. They are paid to look at the future for companies and so on, to imagine scenarios and so on. And that's related to this kind of thing, and it's related to the notion of time and the loops in time, and how we can actually create different levels of reality where you cannot tell whether you're actually creating something or whether you're perceiving that something is going to happen. Again, Guillemot says, our intentions in the future create the past causes of what happens in the present. So you have to be careful, because you could get what you're wishing for, or you could get something else. And I think to be, there is one thing that I'm increasingly struck with, and I tell my colleagues in studying the future, start by stating the obvious. And that's something we don't do. We don't do that in politics, we don't do that in philosophy, we don't do that in religion. We say, this happened because of. But we forget to state the obvious. And I think we absolutely have to go back to that. And I'm struck by how perceptive Shakespeare was in Macbeth. If you remember, Macbeth is riding through the fog in Scotland somewhere, and he meets the three witches, or they suddenly stumbles on these three old women around a cauldron doing something. Remember what the first witch says. She says, "All hail, hail Macbeth, Thane of Glamis." Macbeth is the lord of a little castle called Glamis. That's a fact. Okay? That's stating the obvious. She states the obvious. The second witch says, "All hail, hail Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor." Macbeth is not the Thane of Cawdor. So she states something which is not true. The third witch says, "All hail, hail Macbeth, who shall be king." And there is no way he's going to be king. So his squire, and then they vanish in the fire, they just dissolve. I think that scene is extraordinarily profound, and I think a lesson in this, and a lesson in parapsychology, and a lesson in the study of the future, that his squire tells Macbeth, "Well, my lord, this is good news. You're going to be called to higher destiny." And he says, "What do you mean? The Thane of Cawdor is a fine gentleman. He's my neighbor. He's in good health, and there is no way I'm going to be king." But then the events start happening, and he ends up being the lord of Cawdor, and then the king. And that scene, I keep coming back to it, because there is just so much intuition on the part of Shakespeare, and so much that is buried in those three calls, you know, of the first witch, the second witch, and the third witch, going, stating the obvious, you know, hail, Thane of Glance, and then the second level, and then the third level, all of which are impossible, but will happen. And I think that's the kind of thing we're dealing with here, which is why we need to be careful, you know, about what happens. That's also the play where the word information comes in for the first time, you know. And what is this dagger which informs my mind? I mean, the information, formation inside. I mean, that's what information is, something forming inside. And, you know, I think it's Lady Macbeth looking at the dagger with that doesn't have any blood on it, and then it has blood on it, and she says, she reflects about this dagger which informs. In other words, forms something inside, a perception inside. And that's what information is. So, and we use these terms loosely, but they should not be used loosely. Yes, sir.
So I'm listening carefully, and what I think I'm hearing is that there's an important correlation between intentionality and causation. Is that a fair, or at least that's an area of future research that you're focusing on?
Intentionality, but I think you know, some of the psychics would say that the intentionality may be, you may be unaware of your intention. I mean, you may be in a state which is, you know, of meditation, you know, where you're not intending something, you're just making it possible. And I think that's what was happening with Melchizedek. I mean, I wasn't looking for a cab driver called Melchizedek, okay? But I was intensely, you know, working and thinking about Melchizedek day and night because I was trying to get some research on this.
Right, but how important is it, this whole notion of intentionality, which has been kind of a theme that several people have brought up and was referenced in one of your 4 criteria there. Do you see that as one of the areas of future research that would be key to the information physics?
Yes, yes, and of course one of the tests would be, can we create coincidences? You know, the person who was looking for the movie, I mean, there was an intention somewhere to find the movie, but I take it he had given up on finding the movie, but...
He said one after, you know, this is, okay, the trip was in 1982. 2 years ago, he said to himself, I wish I had a document, you know, I wish I knew who had documented that so I could get a copy of our journey, to see our journey. And that same afternoon, he throws away a plastic bag and there it is in the dumpster, there it is.
Well, that's intentional.
Yes.
But he wasn't like trying to manifest it or anything like that.
Well, he was.
He just wished he had it.
Well, he
But he didn't expect it to turn up.
In feng shui, actually, we work with intentionality every day through ritual, much as Cardenas was doing, and things manifest. But I think when we're talking about intentionality, that's like information. And then there has to be meaning given to it, which is will, before anything can actually happen. Because nothing moves without the will. The intention is just an information that has no life yet. Gayla's friend actually has a very powerful inner will. And so I think he's at a level when he intends something, even though it may be a dissociated intention, it happens.
And I could tell you 15 more stories similar to that one.
Mhm.
Yes, I just wanted to tell you that the experiments I reported at the October IONS convention was about intentionality and visualization. We had, at UC Davis with Jessica's consult, we did experiments where we had groups of subjects that would just keep track of some countable event for a month, like junk mail or wrong numbers, or finding coins. And then the other group would visualize for a couple minutes a day without knowing the theory behind it. And then we just compared the means, and the data was significant, ranged between 0.02 and 0.006. So our next level is to try to get like you did in your classroom, a group of people that are coherent and collectively intending, and finding out can we increase the probability of events on a collective level with people that are intentionally trying to get into coherent, like in Avatar when they had the group visualize the Sigourney Weaver's character. We're trying to take that in the laboratory.
Well, meditation increases coherence.
Yes.
When you spoke about doing away with dimensions as a cultural artifact, would you say a bit more about the model which would replace that?
Sure, yes. Actually, I'm not the only one saying that. There are physicists who are working with. There are a number of phenomena that can be expressed mathematically without using S, Y, and Z. There are a number of phenomena that are where you don't actually need the dimension as a tool to express the phenomena. And,
I have, oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead,
Oh.
save me.
Lifeline, yes.
You wrote years ago a paper stating that yes, it is unidentified flying objects phenomena could be that they are from outer space, visitors from outer space, but actually there are other explanations that are more sexy for scientists. So I wonder if you could revisit your assumptions, and also we all get wiser with time, so perhaps you have a different angle now to add to it.
Let me try to pursue your question first. And then
Yes, I'm sorry.
You can imagine if the present is overdetermined from the past and the future, then you end up with something where everything is simultaneous at that level. Okay? Everything is not simultaneous at this level, but at that level it is. For example, past life memories, a number of the psychic phenomena and so on seem to just not care at all about dimensions. Okay? And you can actually make physical models of cosmological models that don't use dimensions. Okay? For example, I'm not answering your question very well, but if you generalize the concept of dimension, you still have something in which you can account for most of the physics we know and more. So you're not constrained by putting it into these little cases. What I was saying wasn't that it was more sexy for scientists, but I'm really not a theoretician when it comes to UFOs. What I like to do is get into my car and go talk to people who've seen something, and I listen to them. It's much easier to stay home in your armchair and come up with theories, okay? And then, the most obvious thing is, why shouldn't they be ETs? I mean, fine. The problem is that if you listen to people, that's not what people have seen. What they've seen is, first, a lot of energy in a small space, usually manifested as light, that impacts their consciousness in various ways, very often takes control of their consciousness. They perceive something, but very often there was something that happened in the past, and that's one thing that UFO investigators never ask about what was your life like the last 2 days or the 2 days before? They say, well, what did you see? And then what did he do? And then what did he do? And then what did he do? And then what did you do? And so on. But I try to look back and forward. I try to understand the context. I think there are several layers of the phenomenon, not just the physical layer. And then I will come back and I will try to follow these cases sometimes over years. I mean, there are some cases I've been following for 20 years, where I want to see what happens to that person, to the environment, does it happen again, what else happens, and I try to understand the entire thing. So what people are telling me in most cases is not that they've seen a spacecraft come down and land and then take off again. And some people do. But people describe things in their bedroom. People describe things that merge together, change shape, disappear on the spot. I mean, a spacecraft doesn't disappear on the spot. Things that are just a light, just a small light wandering around, and they get terrified. And on several occasions, one case in France that I'm following, the witnesses are two surgeons. And so I asked them, I said, doctors, you're describing something to me that doesn't make any sense, and that as medical people you should know that it doesn't make any sense. You're describing a little light 200 meters away, and you're terrified. Why are you terrified? I mean, it's a little light. It's not attacking you, it's not coming towards you. And they said, one of them said it was the most terrifying event in his life. And he had, this happened in the past, so he's now elderly, and he told me that he had a brain incident, in which for a while he sort of lost sense of reality, and that what he had experienced at the time was like that. It was, now, this is not a spacecraft. It's a little light. It later turned into a spacecraft because it was seen on top of a tree as a light, very bright light, and then all of a sudden there was an object that was about 20 meters and about 11 tons. We know it was about 11 tons because we've measured the impact and we actually have imprints of the impact. And this thing was machined. I mean, we can see the machining on the cast that was made almost immediately. So fortunately, there were witnesses who were equipped with, being able to make a cast very quickly. And so we have actually the detail of the tripod. This thing was machined. Okay, it's a piece of technology. It's absolutely a piece of technology, but not when it was a little light that terrified them. How did that happen? Okay, this is not. So yes, you can say, well, there is an ET civilization somewhere that does that, and they can turn themselves in. But if they can do that, they can be from anywhere, anytime. I mean, they could be from the past, they could be from the future, they don't have to be from a planet somewhere. So the idea, the B-movie, the saucer lands and the ramp comes down and, the robot comes out with a ray and so on. I mean, that was, 1952 or something. That's not what people are describing. They are describing something that's much more complex. And so if you only read 100 cases, you get a certain idea of, an alien and so on. If you read 1,000 cases or 30,000 cases, then you begin to see something that's a lot richer from a scientific point of view, much more interesting, and that's really not so. My job is high technology. So when I'm doing this, I'm doing my job, because the a lot of ideas in high technology have been inspired by people seeing something extraordinary.
Mm.
And so that's why I spend time talking to people. So I don't have a good theory, but I sure have, a lot of. Most recently, I've done published a book last year called Wonders in the Sky, with a young Englishman in Madrid, who is now using the internet. I mean, the internet is wonderful for two reasons. Number one, you can get people together who otherwise would have no way of communicating. So we have a small group of experts, about 10 experts from Russia, South America, the US, Canada, France, and other places, going through old archives. What we're interested in is UFOs before UFOs. In other words, you can actually, we started with the idea that you could throw away, every book on UFOs starts with one sentence. On June 24, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, a pilot over the Cascade Mountains, saw 6 objects and described them as flying saucers. Well, first, that's not true. He didn't say they were flying saucers. He didn't see discs. He saw crescents. And a journalist who was there picked up the fact that he said they were skipping in the atmosphere like a saucer on water. And the journalist called it flying saucers and started the whole flying saucer era, which is fine. I've met Kenneth Arnold. He's a fine gentleman and a good pilot, and he actually saw something that's unexplained. But they were not discs. So every book starts like that, and then says, and then there were waves, including some of my books. Okay, you can throw away his sighting and everything after that, and only look at things that happened before June 24, 1947, and it's exactly the same thing. So the question was, how far can we go? I mean, one question you have to start with, you have to do you have to ask as a scientist when you're with an unknown phenomenon is, how did it start? I mean, what started it? Is it correlated to anything else, like, the nuclear explosion? So many ufologists say, well, this happened because we had, dropped the A-bomb on Japan, and then this civilization sent their spacecraft here to investigate the Earth. Well, they would have to be pretty bad engineers if they had to do it hundreds of thousands of times, landing in people's backyards, stealing their dog, making holes in the ground, and so on. And I mean, if we wanted to, if there was a civilization on Mars, we could take something, the size of this laptop in orbit around Mars would pick up essentially most of the things we would need to know about its civilization before we would land there. So, and it would be undetectable. We could make it stealthy, we could make it invisible, we could do all those things with technology we have today. So come on, I mean, the explanation doesn't explain anything. So we started looking back. It turns out that you don't have to do that. You can throw away everything after 1880, and you still have the UFO phenomenon, including abductions, landings, imprints in the ground, lights in the sky, maneuvers, and everything else that we have in our, quote, UFO books today, okay? And that's very interesting, because in 1880 there was nothing in the sky. It was huge. There were a few balloons, but everybody knew where they were, because the people who flew balloons were like astronauts today. I mean, they were well known, and their experiments were well known, like Montgolfier and so on. So, but there was no CIA, there was no Air Force, there were no airplanes, there was no dirigible. The first dirigible that was able to take off and go back and land at the same place was, I think, in 1885. So if you stop, like we did in 1879, and we found tons of things, but we selected 500 cases that are essentially pass the test of being unexplainable between antiquity and 1879. So that book was published by
I
Tarcher.
read your book, and I found it fascinating, the account of the... Oh, there it is. Good. Maybe you can pass it around with the agreement that you get it back.
But that took 6 years.
I
It took
imagine,
6
yeah.
years by a group of people. And thanks to the internet, because now there are 50,000 local newspapers who've put their collection online. And you can search that. And a lot of museums are digging up, their collections and scanning them, putting them online also. So you need somebody who reads Latin, you need somebody who reads hieroglyphics, you need somebody who reads Greek and so on, but then and Chinese and Japanese and so on.
Well, what do you make up of the account of those astronauts or whoever came? There were 3 people in 2 cases. In one, they were burnt to a stake, thinking that they were witches, and in the other one, they were saved by the bishop of the area.
Yes.
And who allowed them to take off and leave.
Well,
so that's quite remarkable.
That case is, so we made a rule that when you get into that, you get inundated with stories about the Hopi have a tradition that a beautiful maiden came down from the sky in a basket. Okay? I'm ready to believe that. But, tell me, I need a witness, I need a date, at least a year, and I need a place. Where is it? Who saw it? What was the date? So in these 500 cases, we have all of that. We don't have the name of a witness in all the cases, but in a surprising number of cases, we know who the witness was, and what was his social position and so on, and who he was with. So that's remarkable, and we're going to redo it now, expanding it. And so thanks to the book, we've recruited a few more experts who are joining the group on the internet. So, but that's the kind of thing that would have been unthinkable 20 years later, or 40 years earlier when I wrote Passport to Magonia, where I was just scratching the surface. And so this has been a tremendous experience. I mean, this was a real joy to be able to assemble that. But it took 6 years. Nobody got paid. Wasn't supported by anybody. I was lucky that I had a mock-up of the book at a conference at SLN, and the publisher of Tarcher, Penguin, saw it and essentially published the book. But I think that's the way things have to be done. I mean, we're not going to get support for any of this, from anybody. And but if you know the tools and you have access to good people who are willing to spend weekends and evenings and so on digging up through these old newspaper collections, you can get a lot of things done.
What about to do it like an open source in which people can contribute online instead of being all on your shoulders?
Well, we need people who are very well organized and can be critical about the material, because a lot of it we're going to eliminate. Okay, so a lot of the stuff about ancient UFOs and so on is we had to eliminate, either because it wasn't well documented or because we could prove that it never happened, that somebody made it up, or it was a deformation of something else. So, we had a lot of fun doing that too. So, Steve.
Dr. Vallee, I could not help but note that this nice lady's question about what replaces the cultural dimensions, you do away with them, in a way kind of closed the circle. Because this institute, as Sergio mentioned, is the result of an experience that Edgar Mitchell had coming back from the moon.
Yes.
It's an experience that has a number of names, but it is well known down through history. And as he has described it here in this room and elsewhere, it is this moment when, for whatever reason, you suddenly have this complete sense of oneness,
Yes.
in which this entire complex is a singularity and there are no boundaries. It is one thing, and you're in it. They call it the Mahdi experience. Well, that transcends the divisions and so forth. Could we ever look at it that way with comprehension? Is that possible, or is it beyond the finite abilities of humans? To study that way, as opposed to
I don't
experiencing.
know, but thank you for bringing that up. I wasn't thinking fast enough. That is what the psychics and many of the remote viewers describe. Certainly that's what Ingo Swan says. He could move his consciousness any place, any time. And that's that experience of the totality of the universe.
Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever had that moment? Good.
I'm not a meditator, and so I've come close a few times, and I understand what they're talking about. But I couldn't decide to do it, and achieve that.
Both and. Why can't we have dimensions and beyond?
Well, you need dimensions if you're going to build, a locomotive. I mean, so in the physics of energy, dimensions are fine. But when you get to the big things, which is either consciousness or the cosmos and so on, you need other tools. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Some
Duality, we know
information.
duality exists, but we know something beyond it exists, so.
Yes. I think, should we stop here?
You told me, you did fantastic.
Thank you for your questions. Again, always learn more than the other way.
If I get you to sit on that chair, and then everybody around you, I will take a group picture.
We lost a lot of the group.
Yeah, well, the survivors, the hardcore. The hardcore.